Well, that's because there's a gap between physical reality and what I would call paper reality. And remember, these people in Wall Street are always keen to listen to the president. Well, the president says this will be over in a few days, and what happens? Zoop, up goes the stock market. This is minor. This is a mini war. What happens? Things go up. You can only do this so many times, and at some point, the physical reality catches up. And I think that's where we're headed. And we're looking at $200 a barrel before we're through, I think. I think we'll be at 150 before the summer's end, and probably by the end of the year, close to 200, maybe more. And, the other thing is we have to look at the time lag. Most of the tankers that filled up and left the Persian Gulf have arrived at their destinations. There's nothing else coming. So you have to take that into account. There's nothing to replace it. We have large numbers of tankers now in the Caribbean Ocean trying to tank up at our terminals there. And people in Washington are already talking about banning the export of our oil so that we don't run into the same shortages that are afflicting everybody else. So there's no easy solution unless you stop the war. That's the thing. Come on. That ought to be the demand. Everybody ought to be in Washington, D.C., in front of the Oval Office saying, stop the war. Find another way. And that's not happened yet. But the Americans will eventually come around to that. Unfortunately, there's going to have to be a lot more pain before they get there. Our pain threshold is higher than many people think. Right now, if you're paying more than $5 a gallon for super, if you drive a high-end automobile, that's no big deal. When you pay 10, that's a big deal. If you're paying 4 for something else and then you have to pay 7 or 8, that's a very big deal, especially if you're on a fixed income of any kind. And then we haven't even talked about the numbers of jobs that are lost. And many companies or corporations in many places in the world that are heavily involved in plastics and other things are shutting down. Not for a month, not for 2 weeks, but shutting down. And then you got to go back to the oil wells in the Persian Gulf. And if you're not extracting oil, eventually the pressure drops. Then you deal with the water getting into the system. And it no longer becomes profitable to reopen the well. Now, maybe they can drill new ones in the future, but that requires investment. Investment capital flees crisis zones. So who's going to come in there and invest? How do you stop this from happening in the future? And if you listen to the Iranians, they understand this. They want guarantees of no future conflict. In other words, if they sign on for a set of terms, they want those terms to be permanent. And if you want them to give up control of the strait, which they did not have before this war began, they want certain guarantees. It makes perfect sense to me. I agree completely, but for some reason, everybody says, well, that would be defeat. Well, maybe it is. Call it whatever you like, but the world needs to get back to business. We need to restore our standards of living, and our standard of living is falling, and it's getting worse with each passing week.
Yeah, the export bans of petroleum products from the United States, a potential export ban could be, it's a very interesting point that you're making. Of course, the United States is a net oil importer, net petroleum exporter. China is also a very interesting situation, I believe, because they are a great, large refiner of petroleum-based products for the region. Now, they, I believe, have large stockpiles. How are you analyzing that situation? Do you think they will have to stop exporting petroleum-based products in the near future?
Well, the Chinese will if they have to, just as we will. But right now they don't want to because they are essentially presenting themselves as a safe haven for everybody's wealth, cash, and investments. Something that I never thought I would see in my lifetime. I grew up in a world where no one could imagine that suddenly the yuan at some point in the future would be valued more than the dollar or the euro or the German Deutschmark or anything else that we had. But that's where we're headed right now. China is really being viewed as a safe haven. The thing that we don't get, we talk all this time about democracy. We're anxious to promote this notion that that's the only way, the best way, the inevitable end state in terms of government. It isn't. It never has been. And then we describe anything that is not, in our eyes, thoroughly democratic as authoritarian. Most of the world on any given day is ruled by authoritarian regimes, let's be frank. On the whole, they've been extraordinarily stable. Monarchy has been a much more stable system of government than almost any other that I can think of. If you go back to the terrible wars that were fought in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, at least the monarchies were able to cope. They were able to reach solutions. You had treaties that everyone respected. You changed the rules. In other words, it was a civilizational consensus that held things together. That was destroyed during the Second World War. Actually, it was lost stupidly in World War I that never needed to be fought, but it was ultimately destroyed in World War II because you had on one side communism, in the middle you had National Socialism, and then you had, I would argue, in the West, with Great Britain and the United States, radical liberalism. And people say, what do you mean, radical? Exactly what I said. When you start killing 400,000 people who are civilians in firebombing episodes in places like Hamburg or Dresden, to me, that's radical liberalism. Don't dress it up as anything else. So all of this destroyed that sort of civilizational consensus that once existed. And we've never gotten it back. And we pretend that this international order that we created at the end of World War II was somehow or another sacrosanct. But it never was. And it was really designed over time to make us rich. And finally, everybody woke up and said, wait a minute. I'm going to put my money in your bank, and then you're going to tell me whether or not I have the right to get to it? You're going to tell me I don't really own it? You know, when we took action against the Russians and said we just take the 600 billion rubles and distribute those as we saw fit, that was a terrible signal to the rest of the world. It said, you can't trust the American financial system. Why should we put our money in the banks in New York City? And our argument was, well, you can trust us, you can't trust the Chinese. I think we've lost that argument. I mean, there's a lot happening right now. It's, you know, we're all focused on the Gulf, but I guess what the Gulf has turned out to be is a way to throw into sharp relief everything else that's wrong. So whatever comes out of this war, the world you and I are going to live in is going to be very different from the world that still existed when this started. And I think you can make an argument this all really began in February of 2022. Because we intervened in Ukraine. We installed, through a coup in 2014, a government that was not legitimate. It was our puppet. And then we and our European allies began building up this Ukrainian force to fight Russia, to eventually destroy Russia, which seemed to be everybody's goal for reasons that make absolutely no sense to me. But nevertheless, that's the way it is. That's where all of this began. And I think it is now boomeranging, if you will. In other words, it has had the opposite effect. What's happened? Russia is stronger than it's been in a very, very long time. The most recent windfalls from 250 million a day on top of what they were normally making in just oil and gas is part of it. But the Russian population, its society, it's stronger, more cohesive. And what's happened? Well, we've deindustrialized the great titan of industry in Europe, Germany. What a catastrophe. You know, are we celebrating that? Well, there are fools in Washington that think, well, that will prevent Germany from ever cooperating with Russia, which would be disastrous for us. Well, I suppose if you're thinking in purely 19th century terms, I guess you can make that argument. But it doesn't make any sense if you think you're living in a new civilizational construct in which war has become a burden and a liability, not an asset. For some reason, we've determined the opposite. We now think military power is a useful instrument to bully people in order to get what we want. Again, I think it's backfired. I think it's backfired in Ukraine. I think it's backfiring right now in the Persian Gulf, and it has no chance of success in Asia. You know, every time you read the transcripts of conferences in Asia where you bring the leaders of SEATO together, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, and you read what the American representative says and read what everybody else says, the only people talking about war in Asia are Americans. That's it. That's a disaster. I always thought that was the antithesis of what we stood for. I guess I missed the boat.
The point you made about the strength of the Russian economy and society is very interesting. You could make, of course, an argument. A large part of that, the recent success has been because of resource sovereignty as well as a focus on a war economy after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The US in the Second World War would also be a great example of a country kicking itself into gear very rapidly and experiencing economic growth on the back of that. Do you think this conflict could pursue or push the West to perhaps do the same and again focus on commodities, on commodities, and kick its industry back into gear?
Absolutely. I think everybody is on the path to resource sovereignty. I talked to a group of Indian businessmen, and they were very interested in my views, and these kinds of things came up. And I said, your lifeline, you think of it as an extension cord for electricity. It runs from the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz over to Mumbai and hence into the rest of India. That's been cut. So what are you going to do now? And you see, India is a nation that has remained neutral, that steadfastly opposes being dragged into anybody else's war under any circumstances. They really didn't think they'd face this. Right now, they can't buy enough gas to cook in their kitchens. So the Persian Gulf War has gone into the kitchen of every Indian family. Indian housewives are struggling because of the Persian Gulf. And one of the things that they're trying to come to terms with is, what do we do about it? And I said, well, the first step is to bring together everybody that counts on the planet. In other words, all the major powers, try to drag in the smaller powers, bring the leaders in, and you have to present a united front to Donald Trump and say, look, Mr. President, we like you. We're not anti-American, but this must stop. And that's something that they struggled with quite a bit because that's not their approach. They enjoy being non-aligned. They enjoy being neutral, but they are a major power. They have a large navy. They have large forces at their disposal. And if you're not willing to throw your weight into this in some way, then you're going to be a victim. And right now, India is a victim. And their agricultural sector is a huge, huge issue for them. The fertilizer is just not there. And they're trying to get it out of Russia, trying to get it out of China, any place they can, and from us. But there's just not enough to go around. So, I think this crisis is going to change the world. I suppose you could argue that every world war does. This is not really a world war, though sometimes as I look at it economically, it seems that way. But it's going to fundamentally change the way we all look at ourselves. So to answer your question about commodities, that's going to be the centerpiece of everything for a long time. Unless, of course, we have to say this, the aliens finally reveal themselves and provide us with the technology we need that allows us to abandon all these things. The gravity harnessing machines that relate light, gravity, and magnetism and break the laws of physics. Well, I'm all ears. I'm waiting. If that happens, the world changes again. But right now, I think we're stuck with what we've got.
How do you incentivize the West to really kickstart their commodity industries again? I mean, two ways to go about it, I think, is one, a higher price to incentivize these producers. The other one, of course, would be a more centralized government, kind of like China, where you have these long-term incentive plans in place to push production.
Well, when people are in the streets, you'll get action. That's coming. It's already begun, I think, in Europe, but it's really going to get into high gear here in the United States. But you've also hit on something else that nobody really likes to address. The United States is organized constitutionally and politically for the United States of 1787. that doesn't work. Now, the truth is, really, until we involved ourselves in the First World War, we didn't need much of a government. And that may seem surprising, but you got to remember the people that came to the United States before 1914, I would certainly say before 1900, overwhelmingly over that almost 250-year period, wanted a nation where the government that governed least was the best. And if you read descriptions of the United States, and it's the early phase of our development by people like de Tocqueville and others who visited the United States, later on Max Weber came across, they all saw the same thing. They said, things here happen. Bridges are built, roads are constructed, buildings go up, businesses start, and there's no evidence anywhere of federal interference. There's no evidence anywhere of someone centrally directing anything. It's all sort of bottom-up, self-starting. And they even saw sectors where there was some abject poverty among people that had just arrived and they were living in bad straits. But when Max Weber talked to them and when Tocqueville talked to them, they said, well, that's all right, this won't last. And they'll point to others that came just before them a year or two ago who are now doing so much better. So, it was a different country at that point. We were very internally focused, but we were all focused on building prosperity. And the government was seen as an unavoidable necessity, but certainly as an evil that should be, avoided as much as possible. Now, sometimes that was bad, but for the most part, I think it served us well in our early development. That changes in the 20th century. And of course, the Depression changed everything because for the first time, people looked at the government and said, what are you going to do? Up until that point in time, we'd had other periods of economic downturn and depression, and it didn't last long. The government didn't involve itself. The government didn't feel obligated to do so. That changed, and FDR, he tried to do, to be honest with you, what Adolf Hitler did in Germany to recover it quickly economically, and he failed. We were worse off in 1938 than we were in 1932. One of the reasons that we implemented a draft in 1939 was because we were trying to reduce unemployment. Think about that. Now, that's a different world, but we're going into a period that I think will be in some ways similar in terms of economic downturn. But I think you're going to get a lot of people in the streets, and when that happens, you'll see some changes. The question is, what do we do about this country? We're organized into 50 states. Stein, that's ridiculous. We could reorganize the continental United States into, say, 5 regions. 5 regions that are organized in a way that makes sense economically, makes sense commercially. In other words, where is the competitive advantage? How do you make a decision about the Northwest, the Midwest, the Southwest, the South, the Southeast, and the Northeast? Who does what well? Where do we put our assets? Where do we put our investments? What do we do in each of these areas? Now, you just said we were talking about authoritarian states. We've never been organized that way. We've never done those things. Those things have been allowed to sort of happen on their own. But that may not work anymore. So we may need direction to move this country in better directions economically that will have social benefits, obviously. I mean, everybody says, well, look at the healthcare in Finland is great. I said, healthcare in Finland is great because there are only 5 million people in Finland. That helps enormously. What do you do about healthcare for 350 million? A different animal. But if you are willing to re-examine the way you do business, you can improve that dramatically. There are economies of scale, and we have to think in those terms. What makes sense and what doesn't. I mean, this is well beyond anything you want to normally discuss here. But I think we're headed into an era where all of this is going to be up for discussion. And when you start pointing to commodities, that's a major issue in that context. Huge.
Very much a major issue. Of course, in recent times, we've seen export bans from China on antimony tungsten, rare earth elements. Do you think that is the new norm going forward? And are there any specific commodities you have in mind from a military perspective, perhaps also, that you think could join that list very rapidly?
Oh, they already have. And we're going to run out very quickly. Again, it's not a function of what's on the list. We have those things, but you've got to refine it, and so that it's in a form that can be applied. So yeah, I mean, you could reach a point if you don't get enough of what is required on a periodic table under the topic of rare earths or critical minerals, and that's a long list, by the way. It's not short. You're not going to fly any F-35s anywhere. You're not going to be able to go to sea. Your satellites won't perform. I mean, it's beyond the average American's comprehension now. The administration, and I know some of the people behind this, said what we need is a critical minerals fund. Well, that's a good start, but we have the minerals. This is what people don't seem to understand. Canada is overflowing with everything that we could possibly need, but we don't have the refineries. In other words, it's sort of the question of, can we put a man into space? Of course, but somebody has to engineer it. You know, theoretically, that was always possible. And that's why Wernher von Braun was so instrumental in the whole process, because he discovered that in the interwar period in the 30s, along with several others, other German physicists. So that was not the issue. The issue is, how do we engineer it? How do we build it? How do we do it? How do we implement it? That's the problem right now with the question about critical minerals and rare earths. It's not where are they? They can be gotten. That's easy. The question is, how do we refine it? And China did that, spent the money. They've got this giant refinery in Outer Mongolia. And so right now, there's a Chinese bureaucrat, and he's got a desk and he's got a piece of paper that points to some amount of rare earths that are being delivered there from the United States that we're trying to refine. And he said, no, not this week. That's all. It's China's way of reminding us of our dependency. Well, we should take the reminder seriously, and we should try to become less dependent. That doesn't mean we have to be on a warlike footing with China. It doesn't mean we have to be hostile to China. Let's not get confused on this. This is the stupidity that drives things in Washington. Well, China's hostile to us. Well, no, China's a little sick of being threatened by us. That has an impact. You can't open your big mouth every week and talk about the evil Chinese Communist Party. And if you can find a real communist in China, let me know. I'll fly over to meet the guy, because I have yet to find any. But this is our problem. How do we focus on what's really going to count? And I hope this war ends sooner than later. The sooner we get this damn thing ended, the better off we'll be. We can start focus on these things, instead of what we are focused on, which is expending vast stores of things and building more stores of them when it's not really necessary.
Colonel Douglas Macgregor, this has been incredible once again. Is there anywhere you would like to direct the viewers that are still with us?
Well, you can always go to my Substack, MacGregor Warrior Substack, and I try to put new things there every week. It's a lot to be read right now that would be of interest to people on all these kinds of subjects. There's also my website. All you have to do is plunk in Colonel Douglas Macgregor. It'll take you to the website. It's douglasmacgregor.com. And you'll find a lot of material. I also have a channel where all the videos I've done, at least as far back as 2017, are available.